done. Fight!
So, initially I was going to wait until a future update to add the fighting system to the game, but I figured it's a bit too important to wait on considering it's like half the gameplay. By the end of this devlog, I'll have the fighting system up and ready to go, so you can at least fight some wolves and deer when you send your tribe out hunting, and then I'll also have a much more exciting demo for people to play and give feedback on. The link to that demo should be in the description of this video. Alright, let's get started. Usually I like to put the underlying systems first, but I really wanted to make sure that I got a UI that looks nice in place here. I realized while making this that I've been using the UI theme system in Godot completely wrong so far, and using it right made this go way faster. I want the panels on each side to clearly show the stats, health, and equipment of the active character, and I want the fights to be relatively simple. You can either attack with your base weapon, use an item to either heal a tribe member or damage enemies, or attempt to flee from the encounter. Since the maximum tribe size is 12 in the endgame, I need to make sure that the encounter screen supports up to 12 characters on each side. Generally, however, fights will only involve 3 to 4 on either side. Getting the UI actually coded in and working with tracking the active character was a bit of a pain, but once I had that in and the info panels on the sides looked roughly how I wanted, minus the fact that the armor symbol currently looks like a slug, according to some random redditor, it was time to start getting down and dirty with the With a UI in place that looks fairly decent, it was time to actually get in and start the work on implementing the mechanics. I found a Godot JRPG demo that looked fairly promising, so I decided to use the code from that as a general guideline for how to lay out my own code, as well as how to create a basic turn queue. Right now the queue just loops through one at a time for each team, but later it'll take each character's fast stat into account. A lot of the functions that interact with the character objects are stored within the character options themselves, which each fighter node in the scene has stored in a variable. I know that's not confusing at all, but this currently seems like the best way to do this in a scalable way. I've only been programming for a year or so now, so I'm not exactly a god at code architecture yet. I've never really messed around much with signals in Godot, but I figured now's the time. Apparently they're the way that Godot implements something called the observer pattern, which is a software design pattern that basically has a subject that can emit a signal and a bunch of observers who can do something whenever that signal is emitted. For example, if you click a button, any objects that you connected to that button can run a bit of code when that button is pressed. In the code, I used the observer pattern to tell the fighter nodes in the info panels when the active fighter was changed in the turn queue, which shows the currently active fighter on the left and the targeted enemy on the right in the targeting phase. I was thinking about implementing a state machine for the encounter scene, but I don't want things to get overly complex, so instead I just set it to a targeting boolean. I've also decided to put off consumable items in the flee option until a later pre-alpha or beta update. I don't want to overwhelm myself too early with the project, so I'm only going to focus on the core loop of scavenging, fighting, and surviving for now, and then start putting in features in the future. This also allows me to manage the scope a lot easier in the future if I decide that a feature isn't actually essential, which also lets me get a playable version out as soon as possible. Alright, now we've got to talk about... This is the first time I've ever coded any kind of turn-based mechanic. Honestly, even introducing the task system earlier in development took forever, just due to me not really knowing what I was doing, especially with Godot's yield function. Now generally, I try not to follow tutorials very closely when I'm making personal projects. A, because that kinda feels weird to have someone else's slimy code in my personal space, even if it works better. And B, because the only way to actually get better at programming is to get better at problem solving. And the only way to get better at problem solving is to try it over and over until you eventually give up and become a destitute man living on the streets who gave up all of his life's ambition and is now a husk of his former self, devolving into a spiral of drug use and chronic pain. I don't really know if you can call the bugs that I created bugs. It was a lot of trial and error, and a lot of the points I really had no idea what I was doing. One issue, for example, was the way that I made the info panels work. I had the one on the left set to show the selected fighter and the one on the right to show the target, but when the selected fighter was changed, it would show the enemies on the player side, which obviously was confusing and not what I wanted. This also tied in with another bug specifically with the way that the yield function works in Godot, as I talked about earlier. Basically, I was telling the playTurn function to have the AI randomly select a player character and attack them, but in the turn queue, the turn manager just waits until receiving the turn completed signal from the active fighter to move on in the queue. For some ungodly reason, Godot didn't want to continue after the yield function. Eventually, I just said fuck the yield and took it out and just made it dependent entirely on signals. Still don't really know what the issue was with yield, and I'm sure that won't come back to bite me in the ass. But anyway, based on that last video, you probably noticed a key issue. There aren't any animations, first of all, and you can't really tell how much health anything has left. That brings me on to the last and probably most important part of this devlog. Something I've realized lately about games is that game feel is the #1 most important thing you can do to make your game enjoyable. Take FTL for example, again. When you blow up someone's ship, you feel like a god for a couple of seconds. When your ship's burning and everyone's dying, you panic while you're trying to fix it. FTL is one of those games that puts you through the whole range of emotions, and it does it very well. On the other end of that spectrum is a game that I've been playing way too much recently called Vampire Survivors. Now this game looks really goofy, but I saw it had 99% positive reviews, so I gave it a shot, and holy shit, it is fun. You don't even attack, the only inputs are moving around and spacebar to select things in the menus, but that is all it needs. Through just the simple actions of walking around and letting the game do the attacking for you, you get pure dopamine for the entire length of the session. I have literally dumped something like 20 hours into this game in 1 week, which is a lot for my ADHD-ridden self to play one game in 1 week. Back to my own game though, I think it's really important to get the animations and sound design right for what I'm trying to achieve. I want it to be as satisfying as possible to land hits, win fights, and bring home loot on the micro level. On the macro level, I want the player to feel like they're up against impossible odds trying to get further east. Balancing that sense of despair with the short-term wins is going to be a core part of the game design moving forward. But how do I make the combat enjoyable? A. Add some health bars over each character, so you can at least see how much health they have left. That's easy enough. B. Add some animations. I want to keep things simple, so I'll only add a few weapon animations, pretty much just one for each weapon type. But that should be enough as long as I make them really good and fun. C. I had to add a hurt animation with some floating damage indicators to really add that satisfying feeling of landing a hit. And D. Add a little hit sound effect. Yeah, that'll do. For the majority of the sounds in the game, I plan on using JSFXR. It's a free browser tool you can use to make 8-bit sounds for games. The link to that will be in the description too. Anyway, as soon as I had sounds and animations in, it was looking pretty solid. That's also when I realized characters couldn't die yet, so I had to go and code that in. And I also had to look back at the open source JRPG code to see how they handled removing characters from their queue. But once I did that, I just had to make the rest of the game use this new encounter scene during any encounters, and voila, it works. And it wasn't actually all that hard to connect it to the rest of the game, because I did some solid resource-based code architecture in the very beginning. With all that out of the way, now the game's fully playable. If you would like to play the current version, the link to download it for free from itch.io for PC or Google Play Store for Android is currently in the description of this video. If you do play, I really do ask that you give some feedback either in the game's Discord, the link to that should be on the screen now, or in the comments of this video on what you thought of the game so far, and what you think could use some changes. Anyway, thanks for watching this devlog, and I'll catch you next time.